Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to talk about why Soft Reserve is the best loot system. And I know that's already going to get me a bunch of hate because I feel like people don't really agree with that. But let me make my case, okay? And and we'll talk about it from there. So a couple caveats, okay? So the first caveat being we're not going to talk about GDKP in this particular video because it's not allowed on anniversary servers right now. We're going to make a separate video on GDKP. I still think Soft Res overall is superior to GDKP, but that's just more because I don't like GDKP. So that's the first caveat. The second caveat is going to be that this does not apply to top level guilds. So if you're doing kind of like top level PvP or PvE activities in WoW Classic, or obviously if you're doing like top level PvE in retail, this is not going to apply to you. And the answer should be very obvious in my opinion, because the whole issue is that if you're actually trying to be the best, get the best time, kill the most amount of bosses first, like in retail, obviously you need a method of loot distribution which is going to allow you to distribute your loot in a way that it maximizes the effect of that loot on the raid, right? Because the only objective you have at that point is to clear the raid the fastest or kill these bosses that need to be killed. So I think that should be kind of like obvious and very intuitive, and that should be pretty non-controversial. Moving on from that, though, I need to talk about, I would say, Loot Council first, right? Because Loot Council is basically the #1 competitor, I would say, to Soft Reserve, so it's hard to talk about why Soft Reserve is good without mentioning why Loot Council is bad. And realistically, I think the perception out there is that Loot Council is actually the best version of loot distribution that you can have in pretty much any level of guild. So I just said that it was the one that you pretty much needed to use for top level guilds, but a lot of people extrapolate that even all the way to the bottom. They think that like just the autonomy and being able to kind of decide where loot goes makes it the best loot distribution system possible. So I'm going to bring up a couple points where I think that's not the case. We're going to talk about a couple other different loot systems, and then we'll kind of get into Soft Reserve at the end of the video, because you kind of have to take down its competition before you can really talk up Soft Reserve, because at the end of the day, there's not a ton really to say about Soft Reserve. It's a very simplistic loot system, and it's really more about what the other loot systems do wrong and the problems they cause, which causes Soft Res to emerge, in my opinion, as one of the better loot systems. So going back to Loot Council, right? And we mentioned earlier that we're going to use this in the top guilds, but we're not in a top guild. So let's imagine we're in a guild that's kind of like, you're not trying to be top 5 or anything like that. Probably not even trying to be top 10. You're just trying to be a decent guild, and you want to perform well typically on a week-to-week basis, but you're not really looking to have crazy fast times. You're not really like a speedrunning guild. Maybe you do like a light flourish into speedrunning, but nothing super serious. Okay, so right off the bat, I think usually if you're on the top end of these guilds that aren't like the super, so if you're on like the upper end but you're not in the very top 10, there's a huge identity issues within this guild that Loot Council exacerbates. Okay, because oftentimes it's a question of what do we want to be? Do we want to be like actually break into that top 10, or are we comfortable staying where we are? And a lot of guilds will kind of say they're comfortable staying where they are, but realistically you have factions of players within that guild that are trying to break into like that guild top 10. They're trying to inspire other people in the guild to get that fire in them to want to break into the top 10. Okay, because maybe that's like easier in their mind, especially if they're in a good position in the guild they're in. They'd prefer that to happen than to go into an actual top 10 guild themselves and maybe get put on the bottom of the prio ladder, right? Because at that point they're new, and even if they are a good player, people are going to be skeptical, is this person going to stay around? So all that kind of factors into loot distribution decisions. So there's good reasons, I think, why this tends to occur, even though you would think like obviously, well, everybody should just be honest about what they want and transparent, and it'd be so easy to form like-minded guilds at that point, but this doesn't happen with anything in life, right? It doesn't happen in your job at work, it doesn't happen in corporations. Like, nobody is really truly honest about what they want and they're seeking in most cases. So you always end up with this problem, and it's very common, like when you're on the top, but not in the very, very top. And this causes a big problem for Loot Council because now the incentives are not aligned at all, because you have the people that are in the top portion of your guild, right? The ones that want to push and to get into that top 5, top 10 realm, and they're looking at Loot Council as sort of like a meritocracy, okay? They're coming to raid every week, they're coming prepared, they're destroying people on the overall damage meter, so therefore they're like, okay, I definitely, should have greater priority over loot than the guy that's, if we have 20 warriors, I should have greater priority over loot than the guy who's the 15th warrior. Okay, especially if I'm consistent, I come every week. And, that's not an illogical thought to have, but it really contrasts with kind of like what the bottom group of people in the guild typically want, are the people that aren't really necessarily trying to be the best, right? They just want what they would consider to be a quote-unquote fair distribution of loot. In other words, they don't necessarily mind if a top player gets a good item, but they think that these good items should be rotated throughout the player base, right? So even they, at some point, would like the chance to get a good item, is sort of the idea there. So right away, you have that kind of conflict between the two groups of players in the guild, okay? And a lot of times, it's not a conflict that is very widely publicized within the guild. So in other words, like the Loot Council of the guild is trying to kind of cater to both sides here, right? Because they realize that if we only cater to the people on the top, the people at the bottom are going to leave. And then if we cater too much to the people at the bottom, the people at the top are going to leave because they're feeling like, why am I in this guild? I'm putting in extra effort. I'm not getting justly rewarded for putting in that effort. Okay, so they're trying to straddle the line constantly, and they're not really being transparent about what's going on in terms of how they're making decisions with the loot. And that's just going to be like a natural thing, obviously, because they're trying to keep both conflicting crowds happy. And my argument, I guess, would be that realistically, it's almost impossible to keep both crowds happy. There's basically nothing that you can do. And even if you have a guild that has a good amount of skill parity, there's almost nothing you can do to keep both of those crowds relatively happy. And it's not really until you get to that point where you're the very top guild that we talked about initially, where at that point you could kind of give an item to almost any player on the roster, and you could somewhat justify it, right? And it also starts to matter less in that type of roster because, again, the loot isn't really thought about from an individualistic perspective. It's being thought about from the guild perspective, the team perspective, in terms of like what is helping us win the actual event. And the reason why I don't think it's possible to do this in like a normal guild to really like make things equal, quote unquote, or fair, is because just not enough loot drops in vanilla WoW. So there's a concept that I talk about. And there's also this guy, Zatar. He's a YouTuber that he makes rogue content. I really like a lot of his stuff, probably because he thinks similarly to me, I'll admit it. But he makes a lot of content where, especially for Classic, when he was doing like Naxx videos, since there's a lot of really good loot in Naxx, he was trying to make videos where he would talk about trading items like I do in my videos. So you'll notice when I do my priority videos, I'll tell you guys like, well, if you're in a Loot Council and you're not going to get Scepter of the Fallen God from Cthulhu, right? You're going to want to try and get these items in its place, essentially, right? Like, in other words, you're trading Prio on Scepter for other good items that the idea is that if they're put together, they're somewhat equivalent to Scepter. And I think this is a good theory, so I'm not criticizing either of us for using this concept. And again, we're teaching you how to advocate for yourself, right? So obviously, when you're advocating for yourself, you're not necessarily super concerned about how possible something is, because it's kind of like in any negotiation or offer, right? You have to put forward what you want, and then the reality of the situation is kind of going to be somewhere in between what you want, the minimum. It's going to be in between there. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with ever advocating for yourself, and that's kind of what both him and I are teaching our viewers to do. But the reality is it's actually very difficult to to actually get these trades, quote unquote, that we talk about to work out realistically. And why is that? Well, because it's just very hard to find equivalence between items, right? So what if I were to ask you, there's like 3 players in your guild or 2 players in your guild, and they're going to give this other guy Scepter of the Fallen God, and I ask you, what would you want in exchange for that? First of all, if I ask like 20 people this question, okay, we're going to get like 20 different answers potentially. There's not like a really solid answer on what makes equivalent exchange. Also, how many items does it take, right? Are we talking 1 item for 2 items? Are we talking 1 item that's pretty good and 1 item that's sort of bad? Are we talking about 3 semi-good items? There's like a lot of criteria and tiers of items. So this gets very confusing very quickly. But even if you were to figure out the exchange rate of, right, like what a big item costs in terms of other component items, you'd say, right, from an instance like AQ20, you kind of run into this issue where you're never going to drop that actual ratio of items, okay? And you may never drop some of the items at all, okay? So if somebody is essentially waiting for the first Scepter of the Fallen God, that might never drop. And then it's like, you're in this weird position. It's like, okay, are you going to give them now like the second tier item on the list? And then what happens if Scepter does drop after that, right? Are you going to still give that item to them because you told them you were going to give it to them? Or now are you going to give that to somebody else and they're going to be angry? So this whole idea of like trading prio that we talk about, it's not that it's bad philosophically. It's very easily understandable. It's a good way to kind of like we said, teach people to advocate for themselves and try and get items back when they're not going to get the best item. But just realistically speaking, it's difficult to actually have this pay off in practice, right? Or to even be functional in practice, because there's just not enough loot to go around. And think about it, like if I give player X Scepter of the Fallen God, and then I get 2 items in exchange for that, there's 10 healers, 11 healers in the raid, okay? So now there's a bunch of people that haven't even got 1 item yet. They're already behind because we've given me 2 or 3 items for this guy's 1 item. So you've given one guy an insane item. You've given me 2 or 3 items to compensate for that. And we still have like 9 players that don't have a single item yet. Like that just doesn't work, okay? So you can very obviously see like why this is a problem. And also the other aspect of it is that there's just no... People catch on to this, essentially, right? Like, people will understand... If you start doing this and you're only trading prio, essentially, between the top players of the guild whenever there's, like, a decent item drop or a semi-decent item, okay? And the people at the bottom are just getting the absolute scraps. What's going to happen is eventually they're going to kind of realize, and they're just going to be like, hey, man, like, I'm out. Like, why would I stay in a guild where I have no chance of getting a reasonable item? And that's pretty fair. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter if they're performing well or not, right? It's like, you can make the argument, well, man, if you want better items, just perform better. But realistically, like, how is that changing their opinion when they can just go to some random SR run and potentially get gear, right? It doesn't make sense for them to stay in a raid where they're constantly getting beat by people, and that's determining their loot prio. So I feel like a lot of these loot council guilds, they tend to devolve into open doors, right? Where it's the people at the top that are mostly staying together, and they're even further incentivized to stay together given the fact that they're already like indebted into the guild, they feel like. So they feel like they kind of like they're paying their dues as each tier goes by. So they think they're even more likely now to get new items when new tiers comes out. And it's really the bottom of the guild that's kind of like going in and out every tier. You know, you're constantly replacing people on the bottom of the list. And it makes sense because, like, think about it from the perspective of the guild as well as the perspective of one of the quote-unquote weaker players, right? If you have a warrior who is 15th on the list of 20 warriors, and he wasn't first for Band of Ikuria, he wasn't first for Onslaught Girdle, he wasn't really first for any major items. What are the odds that all of a sudden this guild is just going to be like, you know what? Yeah, we're just going to give a really good item all the way down 1 to 14 on this list, and then we're gonna give this guy, oh, Badge of the Swarm Guard dropped, and it's your turn. Okay, yeah, we'll give the 15th best warrior in the guild Badge of the Swarm Guard. No, it just doesn't happen, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense, and people recognize that. They're not stupid, and they just move on to other guilds. And I feel like it's weird because people who are running the loot council guilds, they don't necessarily connect the dots about why this is happening. If you're in recruitment in a guild, it becomes more obvious, because I've done guild recruitment for a long time. So obviously there you deal with the people who are leaving, and you deal with the the people that you're trying to recruit and you're trying to sell the guild to. And I feel like I'm a person who is relatively chill to talk to. So when people would like leave guilds and I'd be in a position like an officer position, I would talk to them, not to like flame them or anything like that, but just to kind of like get their opinion on what didn't work out, why they're leaving. And they would most of the time be pretty candid with me because I feel like I was a pretty reasonable person. They felt like they could be. And the people at the top of the guild, like the actual guild leader who's not doing recruitment, they would be surprised. Like they wouldn't believe how often it came down to like loot stuff. And they basically wouldn't even believe that it was loot stuff or the loot council. And I've dealt with this so many times in like Rock Apes and other guilds where I've tried to tell these people that like, look, the loot system is just not working out. People are upset, right? And they have blinders to it. I think because it's really benefiting them most of the time at the top, right? So they're not even trying to be duplicitous about it. They're having a hard time. They're so biased, they can't even see how the system is really working for them, and it's not working for a lot of the other players. And they'll basically come up with all sorts of excuses and rationalizations as to like why these people left, like, oh, they're loot goblin or something like that. Some of these people they're calling loot goblins didn't even get like an actual major or even semi-decent item. You know what I mean? So it doesn't even make sense to really call them a goblin. It's not like they're trying to take more than your average player or anything like that from the guild. So yeah, like Sophra or Loot Council, basically, I think given enough time, will destroy most guilds, and the guilds that it doesn't really destroy tend to just be the better guilds, and they end up feeding off of the remnants of other destroyed Loot Council guilds. That's how I tend to see it. So, and this especially exacerbates as the game progresses to the kind of like the late game, right? Because for AQ 40 and Nax 40, obviously, it's much more difficult to pug these raids. We may see a difference here in Anniversary. We don't have too much data on AQ 40 currently, but I'm curious to see like what the pug rate of AQ 40 and Nax are going to be on this server once we get into Nax. But it's even if the numbers are a little bit off there, the perception still exists where people want to actually find a home by the time these raids come out, right? Because they don't want to be left in a situation where they're not even killing the bosses that could possibly drop them the loot. So that's logical and it makes sense. And this cannibalization process basically just continues until you have very few guilds left on the server, and then people don't really have a choice of where they're raiding. Okay, so at that point, they're not really opting in. So it's not that Loot Council can't ever work for you personally or for your guild. It certainly can to some degree, but what it probably means is that you're just on the upper end of the food chain, and you're fortunate enough and you have aggressive enough recruitment to be able to constantly cannibalize the other guilds that Loot Council is actually destroying. Okay, because yeah, fundamentally, when you're trying to operate the system, it's just very, very difficult to do. And I want to stress that I think it's difficult even with the best of intentions and a lot of effort being put forth. And what do I mean by that? So to just give you an example from like Rock Apes or some other guilds that I've played in, a big thing with Loot Council for me is like, are you tracking what you're giving out? And you kind of have to track every item, because a lot of times people try and track just big items. That doesn't really work, again, because part of the system involves that we're trying to do some sort of equivalent exchange, even though it's impossible to have a true like one-to-one proper ratio of like a good item to a mid item to an okay item to a bad item, you still want to try and maintain some sort of semblance of objectivity where you are at least giving people a bone here and there, even if it's not the best item. Okay, so to really make Loot Council work, you have to be tracking things, whether they be big or small. You have to be really putting in effort thinking about, okay, like, this guy hasn't gotten loot in a while. He shows up. He's maybe not the best, but he does his part, things like that. So even in a situation like that, it's very difficult to do the equivalent exchange, like I said. But many of these guilds don't even really do the tracking well at all. Like I said, they really only focus on kind of the big items, and the justification for that tends to be like, it doesn't really matter like on something for tier, right? Because tier is just like a class drop anyway, and like who cares? People can just roll for that. And it's like, well, no, because if somebody gets like 2 or 3 tier pieces that are pretty decent now, you've given really good items like Rejuve Gem and the Scepter to 2 other players, and now you have like 4 other players on the roster who've basically gotten barely anything. It just doesn't make any sense, right? And we actually had this problem crop up specifically in this iteration of Rock Apes, where we had some healers that basically got like no gear, right? And there was actually like the system was so bad in terms of tracking things that we actually had a priest, it wasn't me, but get 2 pairs of tier 2 pants on his alt and his main before somebody else like even got tier 2 pants, tier 2 helm, or benediction in Molten Core. So obviously, that's going to ruffle some feathers if you don't do it right. So a lot of these things are not tracked well. They're not really even done properly, but even when they are, it's tough. And the last thing I'll kind of mention about Loot Council is a lot of people try and fix Loot Council by doing some sort of like wish list. Okay, and this is another thing that just tends not to get implemented properly, but even if it does get implemented somewhat properly, it's almost useless because people tend to just list the same item. And because it tends to be a system where you just submit the list and you're not really seeing what other people are putting on their list or whatever, you basically get the same sort of things. Like if I tell you to assemble a wish list on Priest for AQ40, okay, it's probably going to involve the Scepter from Cthulhu. It's going to involve the belt from Cthulhu, and it's probably going to involve the Scarab Brooch from Visk, okay? And it'd be very unusual to not see the other priests essentially like copying that list. And it's a little bit different if you have a software sheet, right? Because you can see visually who is on there, and you'll have a better perspective to be like, okay, so all 5 people put the Scepter like number 1. They all put a soft res on it, in other words, right? So maybe I'm not going to try and compete with the Scepter today, and I'm just going to put my soft res on the helmet from Oro or something like that, right? And when you can actually see what people are resing, it creates a different dynamic rather than just everybody submit kind of like a weird, like a blind wish list behind the scenes, and then it basically just becomes, it doesn't help them at all because it's the item. The wish list basically becomes all the competitive items anyway. So there's really no point in even having the wish list to begin with. So yeah, I think Loot Council is just really terrible, and this isn't even counting the other aspect of it where it takes a ton of time to do a Loot Council properly, right? And people will kind of clap back to this. They'll be like, well, you can take care of that by doing a lot of the major decision making outside of raid. And it's like, well, okay, but now you're forcing those people to put in extra time outside of raid, so this is burning them out even more, right, to make these decisions. And then even then, the most you can do is prepare for some outcomes that are going to happen in the raid, right? Because again, like I said earlier in the video, you might not get Scepter to drop. So if you're planning on, like I was talking to somebody the other day in Rock Apes that still raids with them, and I was telling them to reserve the Scepter from Cthulhu because we were doing some random soft res run because they rotate people in and out of their main run. So I happened to be playing with him, and he's like, oh, well, they're giving me the first KT mace, so... And it's like, yeah, but stuff like that is so weird because you don't even know if it's going to drop or not. You know, I've gone entire iterations of Fresh where, or like versions of Classic WoW where, you know, I've seen Rejuve Gem drop like twice, and we're in Naxx, right? So how you can expect to get an item, some like really rare item to drop like that, you don't even know if it's going to drop. So you can do your best to prepare beforehand, but ultimately, if that item doesn't drop for that guy for like 10 weeks in a row, is he still going to want to keep that? Or are you going to have to go back to the table and like renegotiate this? Are you going to give him something else as compensation? Like I said, like it's just going to create a total disaster. And then if you are trying to do it on the fly, which most of the loot is going to be done on the fly, I would say, right? Because you're not going to have a contingency plan for every possible item. That's going to add an insane amount of time to every raid. And if we're talking like even, let's say 30 minutes, if you do 30 minutes of loot council for every raid, that's quite a bit, especially like when you're doing multiple raids in a lockout even or something, right? Like Molten Core, Blackwing Lair, AQ40. Like once we start incorporating more and more raids into the system, it just gets harder and harder and harder, and it's going to take more and more time. Now, granted, typically you're not... typically, you know, you're not going to need to... You should obviously move on from some items in like Molten Core and Blackwing Lair as more people get them, but even then you have items like Onslaught from Molten Core that are just basically good forever. Okay, so it's still going to be a problem. Like if you do Blackwing Lair, Molten Core, and AQ40 that night, it's not like if your MC drops good loot, if you're dropping Quick Strike Ring, you're dropping Curia, and you're dropping Onslaught, which, you know, you're not going to drop that every night, but even if you drop one or two of them, there's still going to be like hot debates over those items that's going to contribute to your loot time. That's not even talking about the Blackwing Lair decision making as well as the AQ40 decision making. So the decision making time is another thing. It just takes forever, and that's essentially affecting the entire raid, right? Because now everybody who has a stake in those items is having to stay longer, and even if they don't have a stake in a specific item, if they haven't gotten to their item yet, and they're hung up on something like Onslaught Girdle, then the other people are going to have to wait until they finish that as well. So it's never really a good situation. And then, you know, some people will try and shortcut this process by, like I said, making all the mid items kind of just /roll. That's obviously really bad because it completely kind of destroys the integrity of the system, because now you're not allowing people to like trade for certain items. So you really do have to go full bore with this, or not at all. If you're not in a top guild, again, like I said, none of this really applies to a top guild, because ultimately the focus is more just on the raid as a whole rather than retaining the individual players, because the individual players want to be there because they all want to be focused on that goal. All their incentives align, and that's just not going to be the case in any guild outside of like the top 5 or top 10. You're going to have the mixed incentives. So that's basically my spiel on why loot council is bad, and we're going to talk about a couple other systems before we kind of get into Sophros. So the other two that come to mind is really like DKP and Lootless. So we'll talk about DKP first. DKP is in theory a great system, right? Because it has a lot of autonomy in it, because you can pick which item you're bidding on, okay? Then it really allows you to create incentives within the guild in terms of what you give out DKP for. So that's great. So this system seems fantastic on paper. It's just the problem is the logistics of it, okay? And I am factoring that into the video because it is just a realistic thing where a lot of people don't want to spend tons of time outside of raid, double checking, triple checking spreadsheets. Then they don't want to have to bring that knowledge inside of the raid, right? Because if you have one of these DKP systems, you have to be updating it essentially in real time in the raid in order to... This guy, bro. We're not going to fight him right now because we're doing a video. But, yeah, so you're not going to... You basically have to have a way to implement that system quickly while you're doing loot in the raid. Now, sometimes you'll have people go above and beyond, and they will essentially do something like they'll create a program that does all the numbers for something like DKP, and then you'll just give that to your loot guy in the raid, and they can have that running while the raid's going on. Okay, so, but that's the very small minority of people, and again, that's asking a lot of certain people in your guild to develop that program, to maintain it, if there's bugs with it, to solve those, right? And then, again, if that guy leaves your guild or something, now, is he going to keep maintaining the add-on? There's all sorts of difficulty there, right? So that's something that I factor in a lot for sure. It's just the ease of what this stuff is. It's kind of how easy it is to implement this stuff, because I totally sympathize with the idea of, like, you don't want running a guild can be hard enough, especially with 40 people in it, 40 personalities, and having to deal with a loot system that's just spreadsheet after spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and the stakes being pretty high because people are going to be really upset, obviously, if things go south. It's just not good. So that's really the struggle with the DKP for me. It's a really good system in theory. I'm actually going to make a video on how I think Blizzard should implement some type of in-game system to do something like DKP, because I think that would actually be a great solution to this problem. It would, if it was done automatically, if Blizzard had a pretty reasonable system with pretty good custom options that you could set up for something like DKP, then I think that would actually be a really strong option and that would probably overtake Sofres for me for the best loot system. But until that happens, it's just really difficult. And the other system I want to talk about is Loot List. So Loot List it's kind of like one of my favorite systems, because it's sort of like a hybrid between Sofres and DKP, in the sense that it's trying to give the agency, but it's giving the agency without the same level of complication, because it's just easier to keep track of everything, because it's really just where you rank on a specific item. And there's not really this whole aspect of, like, you have to worry about, like, bidding and thinking about, like, a min-max bid, and thinking about how are we going to make the system fair for new people that come into the guild, because that's a big problem for DKP, right? You have to figure out, like, what's the sweet spot for having decay on points. Is there going to be a maximum number of points? Can you bid a maximum number of points at one time? Like, all these things are kind of complicated, and people can have different opinions about them in DKP. In Loot List, it's not really the same. It's basically just like you make a list where you list the items, like kind of 50, with usually 50 being the highest priority, and then you go down to 1 being the lowest priority. And everybody submits the list, and you have like a Google Sheet basically sort them on a per item basis. So, and then when an item drops, you just look at the list, see who's highest, and if two people are the same, they roll. If somebody is like the highest roll or highest value on an item, they just they win that item. So that's a compromise, right? It's a pretty good compromise, I would say, for DKP, but it's still a lot of work, honestly. We did this in Season of Mastery in Rock Apes, and it was a great system. And we even had a guy who made a program to make it really easy during the raid, because that's another kind of downside if you don't have some type of automated process, like some type of add-on that helps you out. It's a little bit annoying if you're the loot guy. I was a loot guy, and before we had the add-on, you had to keep checking to see, if this person actually was the highest on any given thing. And like, there's going to be some times where you're going to know on certain items who's going to win something for the big items before you go into a raid, but even then, you kind of have to deal with the small items as well, right? You can't escape that because they're still a part of the loot list. So it gets a bit tedious and annoying. And we were really fortunate to have somebody make the add-on for us. And it would have been even more annoying if we didn't have the add-on. But even with somebody making the custom add-on for us, the people who were in charge of managing the actual sheets just kind of didn't want to do it after a certain point. It was too much of a headache, too much work. Even sometimes getting people to submit their sheet, which is hilarious, because I don't know, people just have no. I start to believe, honestly, sometimes all the claim about like people's attention spans nowadays, because it's weird to me how you can't get people to fill out a simple sheet that is basically going to make things like way easier for them loot wise. So yeah, I can't understand how people just have such a like they can't even do something simple that's going to benefit themselves. So it's a little bit weird. But am I like lagging? I think I'm lagging. Oh, whatever. I vanished, so hopefully I don't die. But yeah, so I think Lootless is a great system, but again, it just has that flaw of kind of like the fatal flaw of just too much time being required from the actual people on top in your guild. Which brings us finally to Softres. So the reason why I think Softres is by far the best system for most people in Classic WoW is just it combines autonomy with speed and ease of use for the people that are like on the top of the system. So we'll kind of go through those one by one, right? So autonomy, very obvious. You can pick which items you want to reserve. You can even augment Softres a little bit. So if you really do want to do loot council on very specific items, you can just remove them from the pool. And there's a website that is very popular. Everybody knows how to use it. Really simple to use. That it's really easy to set up all these custom parameters for. So there's that. And then you can even integrate it with Gargle. So it shows you who actually has the Softres when you go to link an item in Raid. So now even the distribution aspect, whereas before it may have been annoying if you would have did like a normal Discord Softres where you have to type something out in a Discord, put it in a channel, and then somebody has to actually verify by going to that channel to check to see if you Softresed it. Now you don't have to do that. You can import it into Gargle, and you have all the data right there. It also prevents people from changing the Softres if people forget to lock the Softres sheet. So there's basically just an already popular add-on that it's super integrated with this system and makes it just really easy to make use of the system. So ease of use is the number one thing. Then well, that also takes care of speed as well, right? Because like we said, the add-on enhances the speed at which you're able to actually get the items out. So it's not like you're taking like 30 to 40 minutes after the raid doing Softred, just get all the loot. You're basically kind of doing loot like as if people were /rolling. It's just that if somebody gets the Softres, they get the item automatically. So in some ways, some items are going out even quicker than a rolling system because you don't have to wait the 15 seconds for the roll. Like you can just auto loot it to somebody who has a single Softres. So great system in that regard. Then the autonomy, right? Obviously you get to pick what item. In a lot of Softres systems, you can actually pick which item, like you can do double soft reserves, triple soft reserves, which I think is generally speaking a good thing. Because it lets people kind of denote, do we want this item more? Do we want it less, right? How much do we care about it? So it gives you not only autonomy in a, like on the surface level, but it kind of gives you a decent degree of autonomy, right? It's not just like, I want this and everybody else wanted it too. It's like, I want this like 3 times as much as this other guy, essentially. So it gives you a level of precision there in terms of indicating exactly how much you want it, which is always good. And I think the biggest thing with that system is that there's nothing that it ties back to, if that makes sense. So one of the things, and this is kind of going to go back to loot council that we talked about earlier, is how people are making these decisions in the loot council. Which means that when people are unhappy, especially with specific decisions that get made, whether that be why somebody didn't get a piece or why did somebody get this piece and I got that piece, whatever it might be, those decisions can actually be tied back to a group of people or even in some cases like a specific person or 1 or 2 people. So that's obviously bad because it's just really easy for resentment to get built, right? And it's also easy for certain narratives about cliques or conspiracy theories to form because it's like, oh, this guy doesn't like me, that's why he's not giving me item X, or he prefers to give items to his friends. Look, he gave this to this guy, this to this guy, and there's basically like a breadcrumb trail of this happening. So it's very easy for people to kind of lean into all these theories about like why they're not getting loot, whether they be the truth or not, completely different story. But regardless, it kind of gives people that, that it gives people the avenue to start thinking in that way. Whereas in SoftRes, it's basically, just not, that's not a thing. And realistically, the more SoftRes runs that existed, like if the majority of runs were, if it was 90% SoftRes, 10% Loot Council, then people wouldn't even really think twice, because it would kind of be like, well, this is the status quo, right? So, maybe my item doesn't drop, maybe, 3 other people reserve it this day and I lose it to this guy, but at the end of the day, it is what it is, right? Because I chose the item, and then outside of that, it's RNG. I can't blame anybody. It's nobody else's fault. Can't pin it on anybody. And I think that's honestly a huge mitigator for drama, is just the fact that the system itself is kind of taking care of what's going on. And the only person you can really blame at the end of the day is yourself and in RNG, right? So I think that's a huge factor in terms of mitigating all sorts of potential drama in your guild or in your run in general. Now, there are drawbacks with SoftRes, and I think it mostly has to do with the fact that it's kind of a system where it's like a win more system to a degree, where if somebody wins items early on the system, it kind of gives them a bit more leverage in terms of the other items, because now they don't, they don't need as many items as, like if you have a priest that, let's say all the priests in the raid want 8 items, and some priest wins 3 items early on. Now he has a lot more leverage in terms of his soft-reses, because he gets to, focus them more on areas where now these other people, they still need all 8 items, right? So in that system, in that way, it kind of does become a bit of a win more, but you're not going to have a perfect loot system any way you go. And in my opinion, most of the time, this is not really going to work out worse than something like Loot Council still, okay? And it's definitely not going to leave the bad taste in people's mouth of something like Loot Council. And realistically, in terms of the only other thing I can really think of that people tend to complain about is that people getting the certain loot in SoftRes doesn't necessarily correlate with their performance, right? Because you might have somebody in your raid who's the top parsing warrior. They have the same amount of reserves as the lower parsing warrior. And that can be frustrating. But again, if you were in a Loot Council guild and you just gave the items to the top parsing warrior, now your guild is you're still risking guild stability by doing that, right? So you're basically sacrificing a bit of how would you say, like, loot efficiency in terms of optimizing where the loot goes when you're doing SR, and you're gaining group stability by giving everybody a quote-unquote fair or equal shot at the system. Now, you can also do things like you can weight the system in certain ways if you want. So you can have something like one of the runs I go to is, if you parse gray or whatever, you can't roll on Onslaught Girdle. Like, feel like that's pretty fair. That makes sense, right? So you can have some very bare bones minimum incentives like that to make sure that people aren't, completely just running through the raid getting carried. And, you can do, I've been in other runs where the run I do on Wednesday is basically like if you soft reserve the same item over and over, you actually get a bonus towards that item, and they track this in an external spreadsheet. Now, this kind of runs into the same problem that DKP has, right, as well as the loot list, where now you're relying on an external source. It becomes much more of a pain for the people who are putting on the run. However, I would say with SoftRes, that those systems aren't integral to the actual SoftRes system itself. Those are just kind of additional things you can do if you decide that you want to go the extra mile. Whereas if you're doing something like Loot List or GDKP or Loot Council, now all that extra effort is essentially mandatory, right? Because if you're not tracking things with DKP, then your guild's going to fall apart, because what is even the point of having a system if you're not tracking things properly? Same thing with Loot List, right? If you're not actually keeping up the list properly, that guild's just going to implode because the whole loot system that people bought into was a farce. And then if we go to Loot Council, like I said, if the Loot Council's not being run with a high degree of integrity, again, people are just going to dip. And even when it is run with a high degree of integrity, a lot of the times people dip. So, soft res, you can augment it however you want, but at the end of the day, it's still that simple system, and it basically checks all the boxes. It's quick, it's easy for the officers to use, and it gives personal autonomy. And I think those are the three main factors that people look at. I think it basically hits every spot because it's hitting. It's ease of use for the people running it, which the people running it like. It gives autonomy for the people participating in it, which those people like. And then it's quick, which everybody in the raid likes, right? Because the officers want to get out of there, the guild members want to get out of there. So really it's just a kind of like a win if you're not willing to put in extra effort. Obviously, the more extra effort you're willing to put in outside the raid, other systems become better. But on the whole, if I just had to recommend a system for any random guild that's having like trouble with like loot drama or whatever, I would just recommend soft res, even in spite of the fact that, like I said, it can be a win more system. But you can position yourself to put yourself in a smart, like if you're smart about how you do your soft res, you basically make it less likely that somebody in your raid is going to just win out like that. So it also kind of rewards players for thinking about which items are good for them, which items they can go without, which items they really need. And I never think that somebody thinking more about what's better for their character is bad for the raid or bad for the player, right? I think any system that incentivizes that is only a good system. So that's my thoughts. Kind of a long one, but we'll make a video on GDKP and how I feel about that, like a retrospective now that we're how many months? Like 8 months into, actually more than that, more than 8 months into anniversary. So thank you guys for watching. Hope to hear from you, and I will talk to you again soon.